When we're talking about gender, what are we talking about? Today we are looking at the way men and women, boys and girls, people with disabilities, and ethnic minorities, and how they are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But more importantly, is how they use their capacities wherever they are placed in society, whether they are men or women, they are old, they are young, people with disabilities, minorities, how they use those capacities to create resilience to climate change. So when we're talking of gender, we're actually talking of a social inclusion lens. We're not just talking about the binary men as opposed to women. We're talking of differences between the roles that men bring in, the roles that women bring in. So we're looking at a multiple lens that includes other social markers, because these are very important. And I think that's where we've gone wrong with the debate on gender, by looking at it as men and women, because men and women are further differentiated by the way, what age they are, what ethnicity they belong to, how vulnerable they are. So what we are saying, let us not look at men and women as a homogeneous category. All too often, we talk of women. Women are disadvantaged by climate change. They react differently. I'd like to give you an example from the Turkana. When you talk of the Turkana women, because of the impacts of climate change, the Turkana women have lost their husbands due to climate change-induced conflicts. But there is a difference between between married Turkana women and widowed Turkana women. The married Turkana women will be able to have access to labor, male labor, because of their networks, because they live in a household, not in a family, in a household. And therefore, they're able to look at this and draw these different resources. On the other hand, widowed women who have lost their husbands due to climate change-induced conflicts, they have no source of labor. Therefore, they cannot keep livestock. Livestock is the economy, is a livelihood for the pastoralist communities in Turkana. So when we're looking at women, Turkana women, we have to differentiate. Are they widowed? Are they elderly? When we come to the elderly, again, this takes on a very significant purpose. I remember during the last drought, the 2011 drought, the face that came to Kenyans on the newspapers was of this elderly woman who was hungry, had nobody because of social exclusion. She has no children, her grandchildren probably all dead. Her children could have gone on because of climate change vulnerabilities, moved on to the urban areas. But this was the picture that we saw of this woman. Unfortunately, she died. What I'm saying, women like her do not need to die. Because by putting them on the map, not putting women as a homogeneous group, and saying there are differences, depending on your age, your ethnicity, and where you are in the social strata.
Thank you. That makes it very specific and very visible. Thank you. Margreet, as we move into, in this project, we're looking at the whole range of water uses, but increasingly we're looking into things that are into the high value crops, or in Bangladesh also garment industry and other kinds of uses. So can you give us specifics from that or from other areas of why do we really need to pay attention to gender in water security?
Thank you, Ruth. Thinking about this, I think what I would like to make a small plea for is that I think it's important when thinking about gender and when looking at the world from a gender lens to look a bit beyond technical solutions or beyond projects of just a couple of years. And I think looking from a gender lens also means looking at how development and economic growth themselves are often premised on gender difference and unequal gender relations. And I think the garment industry in Bangladesh and production of flowers in Ethiopia are very good examples here. Because why is it that garments are produced in Bangladesh? Because water is cheap, but also because there's cheap labor, and a lot of that labor comes from women. Why is it that flowers can be produced with a lot of profit in Ethiopia? The same reasons. It's because the land is cheap, water is cheap, and labor is cheap, and a lot of that labor again comes from women. In the 1980s, a long time back, we had a very famous anthropologist and feminist, Maria Mies, who came up with an interesting thesis. She said, actually, economic growth is importantly made possible because of a very specific ideology that portrays women as housewives and men as breadwinners. Because women are seen as housewives, they can also be paid less. That's what justifies, and so she said a lot more and in a much more sophisticated terms. And of course we have moved on from this, but I think this very simple idea of questioning how is development happening and how does gender difference and unequal gender relations and gendered power structures make this development possible is a fundamental question that we also need to ask when we look at water security. And then we may actually find that we may need to consider the possibility that water security and water productivity are not always compatible. So that's the only thing I want to say, I think.
Oh, very good opening. Mahbuba, your work has been really instrumental in opening up an analysis of the issues of gender differences in disaster, both impacts and response. Can you give us more examples on that and make that real for us?
Thank you very much. While we have been facing two major disasters in Bangladesh, after many years, like the first two consecutive floods were 1955 and 1956. After that, we had two consecutive floods in 1987 and 88. So till then, there was a theory that is natural theory, like disasters occur due to the natural settings of Bangladesh or hydrogeological reasons, but there is a human phase that was not counted properly. So then my dissertation on how do people cope with this kind of disaster when there is no official setup, specifically no policy or no wing to serve the disaster affected people, how do people cope? So there was no theory when I started collecting data. Then the theory came that disaster affect both women and men, but there is a gender phase of it. Like it affects women more than men due to their cultural and gender identity. So within the gendered economics and gendered culture, women face a lot of challenges because they are the home-based workers, while men migrate or move elsewhere to search for work because they do not get work during the disaster because agricultural fields go underwater, especially in the rural areas. Then women, they identify a lot of home-based activities which are very crucial for the household level coping, to fetch water, everyday water, collection of water, to provide food to the children and looking after the children, livestock, poultry, elderly, and the other items in the household. And also they adjust consumption pattern. They do not know that how to purify water, but use their indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices. So the theory is that that although women are vulnerable, we identify always as the vulnerable, but they have the indigenous coping mechanisms, they have the adaptation technologies, which make them resilient rather than only vulnerable. So these dimensions came out from my research that yes, due to the cultural, economic, social, political reasons, women are more vulnerable than men, but at the same time, they are contributing more to the water shortages cases, to the food security issues, and as well as other factors. And this is the innovation I can say that is going on, but still we are focusing on vulnerability perspectives. But we have to see both, that they are vulnerable, but at the same time, they are the most contributors. I'm stopping now. Then
no, that's a really good, and there's a tie-in to what Maggie opened with in terms of women's capabilities being an important source of resilience. And I want to hear from Tom in the opening, but I want to come back to that theme and to say how do we actually expand on that. So Tom, in the water supply, sanitation, hygiene area, my impression is that things have taken a different evolution, but can you tell us how gender issues are playing out in that?
Okay, thank you. I wasn't expecting to be on this panel, but never turned down the opportunity to be the only man. And although I wouldn't consider myself a gender expert by any means, clearly gender equality, and in particular the empowerment of girls and women is absolutely central to all of UNICEF's programs, not only our WASH programs, but also the programs that we run on education and health. Now, I sit in the JMP, the Joint Monitoring Programme, which is responsible for producing estimates on outcomes, but UNICEF country offices are engaged in developing more inclusive approaches, which lead to, or do not lead to, equitable outcomes. But if you reflect a little bit on what's been going on over the years and the shifts that we're seeing, then I think the big shift that we've seen is really just moving beyond the infrastructure itself. So moving beyond infrastructure and focusing particularly on behaviours, so the way in which people behave in relation to water, sanitation and hygiene, and focusing on the more sort of social and economic barriers. So, of course, the physical barriers are the iconic ones. Esteemed colleagues here have produced reports on the drawers of water since 1972, and still that's the image which is used on posters for the purposes of fundraising and so on. But there's also been a lot of work on making infrastructure facilities more accessible, not just water points and sanitation facilities, but also in schools, where there's been a lot of work, particularly by UNICEF on water and sanitation in schools for boys and girls, but also students with disabilities. But I think the focus on behaviour is slightly different, and this has been growing. And I think this comes from, firstly, a recognition that sanitation behaviours are very different across countries, within communities, within households. And so this is where this sort of idea of community-led total sanitation has come from, the recognition that it doesn't matter what you do if other members of your household are not also using a basic toilet, then that's going to have an impact on you, it's going to have an impact on your community. And we see very different behaviours amongst men and women, but also amongst men and women of different ages. And so that's a major focus of CLTS programs, is trying to get men and women and girls and boys to sit together and to discuss how to solve this common problem. And there are issues of exclusion from facilities on the grounds of gender, and we have many examples of that. But I think the more interesting one is the way in which different people use the same facilities differently. So if we take drinking water, for example, we may find that women are primarily using water supplies for domestic purposes, whereas men perhaps are interested in using them for more productive purposes. And the reason that this is important is that this then impacts on the values that men and women are placing on these facilities, and it impacts on their willingness and their ability to invest in them and to pay for them. So focusing on this whole issue of behaviour and whether the barriers to accessing and using facilities are to do with gender roles and responsibilities, and how that is tied up with the whole question of economic empowerment, I think is a really interesting and challenging area that we're now very much focused on.
Can I just follow up a little bit? That's really interesting, tying it back to this issue of investment. So do you think, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but do you think that women's economic empowerment could contribute to more investment in water supply and sanitation kinds of?
In principle, yes, it could. But I think the question is probably more, what kinds of facilities are women interested in investing in, and who decides? Who decides what kind of a facility is provided, and who actually pays for it? And it may be that men pay for it up front, and then women pay for it day to day, for example, and that can lead to unexpected outcomes in terms of the sustainability of the system long term.
Do you want to expand on that? How that could affect the sustainability of the system? Because yesterday there was talk about payment and charging, but do you want to say how that, if women are doing the day-to-day payment, how that might affect the sustainability?
Well, I think the experience from our programs will tell you that where the users are closely involved in decisions about how the systems are being designed, how much they cost, what type of facility is actually in place, then they are more likely to be willing to pay for it and to continue paying for it over a longer period of time than if it feels like it's been designed elsewhere and then or designed on their behalf, should we say. So it matters less who's paying for it. What matters, I would say, is that those that are expected to pay for it have been involved in its design.
Actually, Mahbuba, would the same kind of principles apply in disaster preparedness or response in terms of involvement in decision making, and how might that play out?
Yes, like a long range of disasters we are facing in Bangladesh, and most of them are related to water. So like flood, arsenic contamination in groundwater, cyclone, salt built up, then depletion of groundwater, availability of fresh water, degradation of biodiversity. All of these are related to water and also related to the technology. Like what kind of technology we are going to offer them for collecting arsenic-free water, for collection of water from a technology like already we have those sources of water depleted. Like we have canals, bills and houses, so we don't find those water. So there is a main point here, that gender division of labor, like strict gender division of labor, that carrying water is a women's gender specific job, which is not well looked after. So if we give even technology, sometimes we do not test whether it is gender sensitive or not, because we are not focusing on the culture, who is collecting water. So the decision making is important here during the installation of a water source, like tube wells. If it is more than 500 kilometers, if it is in a community public place, that means women were not part of the decision making. What kind of technology? Like we have a tube well. That tube well is so heavy, arsenic-free tube well, but it needs 2-3 men to pump that one. So that technology, if it is not gender friendly, the policy and program, if it is not gender sensitive, and especially if women do not take part in the decision making, well, the plan, the procedure, the preparation of water. And another, I already discussed that gender division of labor. It is easy for a man to carry water, but because it's women's job, so they have to carry. So we have to work in the policy making level. At the same time, like sensitization of community, even through the curriculum. So it is a long kind of policy changes environment that is needed, and women's participation in decision making and managerial role, and also taking their voices. So it is already started, because we have been discussing this last 25 years. Some places it was changed, but culturally not yet. Specifically, there is a rural-urban differences. The sources of water, where nature is giving sources of water, women have to go. So although they have to play that key role, but they have to walk through 200 yards to more than 2 kilometers. So because it's a gender-assigned job. So that is one area we find, and another the decision-making roles they have to, and another is who are providing technology. So they need to be sensitized and discussed with both women and men, so that is accessible. The sources of water I'm giving is, because during a disaster, water becomes the threat rather than becoming survival. Yeah.
Margreet, you're trained as both an engineer and a social scientist. Would you like to comment on this? And also, well, as I mentioned earlier, we've been talking about gender issues for, at least since my graduate school days. This was, gender would surface and then disappear and then bob up again and disappear. Is there something different now? What's new? What's different? And especially on this interface between design, investment, decision-making, and gender.
I think what is new, or what is different, is that when we started thinking about relations between gender and technology, you could clearly distinguish two streams of thought. There were those people who thought, okay, let's embrace technologies because they can also help liberate women. So we need to make technologies more suitable so that women can use them, and then that will help empower them. There was another stream of thought that said, no, technologies, engineers, most engineers are men, have always been men, so there must be something in technology that is intrinsically bad for women. It's negative, so it will always have negative effects. So we need to, technology itself is suspicious. So those were the two I'm simplifying, of course. So now, what the line of thought now is a more interesting one, actually, is looking at how gender and technology mutually constitute each other. And it's a more complex thought, a complex idea. It's the idea that how come, and it's also partly reversing the research gaze. It's also asking the question, how come that most engineers still in the world are men? And what does the fact that most engineers are men, how does that matter for the technologies they design? But also, more importantly, how does manhood and masculinity itself partly gets constituted through the profession of engineering? Or to say it differently, engineering in many societies is becoming an important site for also becoming a true man. What this means, to say it very simply, what it means that for me, as I'm trained as an irrigation engineer, I have to face a difficult choice. Either it's because it's very difficult, and we have also done studies in South Asia, in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, studying female irrigation engineers. And what we saw is it's very difficult for women to combine their identity as a woman with their identity as an irrigation engineer, because being an irrigation engineer per definition also means that you're a man. So if you're a woman and an irrigation engineer, it means either you're not a very good irrigation engineer or you're not a real woman. And I'm giving this example because it puts the question at a different level. It looks at constructions. It looks at constructions not just of technology, but also constructions of gender, and how the two influence each other.
Maggie, I know this is differing from what we talked about earlier, but in the area of like climate smart agriculture, would you say it follows this pattern, or are there promising areas, or are there challenging areas in terms of development of technologies or practices that meet the needs of women and men, or differential needs?
I think as I said at the beginning, we need to stop looking at men and women as a homogeneous group. Women vis-a-vis men. More importantly, when you're talking of climate smart agriculture, when we're talking of water insecurities, we need to understand that men and women are not just victims. What are the capabilities that they bring into a situation? They are actors. But the way they act is embedded in the wider social differences in society, is embedded in the inequalities. So we have to look at the context-specific situations. I often say, when we talk about gender, everybody says, oh, it's about women again. No, the situation demands. For example, if you look at the boy child in South Sudan, who has been made vulnerable, one, by the conflicts and by climate change impacts. They're being conscripted into war. They're becoming child soldiers. What we need to do is to understand that yes, the boy child is disadvantaged in South Sudan. But what are the capabilities they're bringing in? They may be victims, but they're also actors. They're not just waiting for things to happen. So I think I want to continue to emphasize this point, and taking on what Margreet said, we need also to disabuse ourselves of these notions. Male engineers, male farmers, male-headed households. Because if we miss these differences, both between men and women, and both within these categories, there are women who are not made vulnerable by climate change, but they do take advantage of the situation because of where they're placed socially. So before we begin to bring about an intervention, let us understand where everybody is coming from. And
no, go ahead. No, I just wanted to add on if I may.
Yes.
It's because I very much like what you say, but I think it's important to also do that for those who intervene and those who know. Those people who intervene and people who produce knowledge about climate change are not contextless. They also come from a context, and I think it's important to think about where that science comes from and who does it, and to also question that.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to? No, I think I couldn't agree more with Margreet. I mean, I'm a geographer by training, and for a long time, geography has been a male-dominated discipline. And we talk of the male gaze. How we look at things. For a long time, we missed out the women farmers because we were documenting male farmers. And this had implications in Africa, and I believe also in Asia. Women actually are the food producers. So when you make women farmers invisible, it means that when the extension officers come to advise them they will not talk to the woman, they will talk to the man. And when they talk to the man, when I was growing up in primary school, we had this thing called the broken telephone. You tell somebody this thing, by the time it gets to that end, it's completely distorted. Now, if the extension officer is giving the man the advice, because that is the farmer, the man then tells his wife, but that message is then distorted. I mean, no wonder food insecurity has challenges. So the way we, and I think this is very critical for us in Britain, the way we look at our society, the way we look at the differences, when you bring about a technology, is this technology reducing or increasing the burden of men and women? If it's water. Is it, as you said, increasing the economic burden? So these are the things we need to look at.